Do you find yourself frustrated that your shots are constantly too bright or too dark? Then this video is for you. This video guarantees that you will know how to nail the light levels in your photos and videos no matter how new you are. Results are not guaranteed. If you watch this video and still don't know how to properly expose a photo or video, you may not be entitled to compensation. Please comment right away if you experience a massive influx of Instagram followers or other social media growth. Okay, that video intro was definitely cringe, but admit it, a very large part of you enjoyed that. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody out there on YouTube, wherever you are in the world, whatever time of day it is for you. I hope you're doing well and recovering from that cringe. If you're new here and you haven't already taken the time to bless that subscribe button and the notification bell right next to it, please take a second to do that so you do not miss my weekly video uploads as well as my weekly live streams where I spend the entirety of it just chatting with you guys. I also just wanted to briefly mention that I did release some merch recently, and this merch line is intended entirely to help me get out of debt quicker. And if you're interested in helping out with that, you can check the video description. There will be a link to my merch store where you can pick some of your very own merch up. That was a very weird way to phrase it, but you can tell I'm new at the plugging stuff thing. When I first started taking photos, I massively underexposed my photos. The blacks were completely crushed, and the brightest parts of the image, while they were exposed okay, they were still a little dimmer than they should be, because I was so afraid that it would be harder to pull the lights down. So if I overexposed it, I was afraid I would be having a harder time getting that fixed than I would by boosting an underexposed photo, which, I mean, honestly, in my experience, that's actually kind of true. But then I reacted to Peter McKinnon's beginner photography mistakes and had my mind absolutely blown by a very basic concept for both photo and video called the histogram. Well, understanding how the histogram works is all well and good, but if you don't know how to make it to where the histogram is nice and even across the whole shot, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good. I then made the connection with a principle that I had learned from learning about photography and videography for the last little while called the exposure triangle, the connection between that and making the histogram work properly. What I want to help you understand in this video is how each part of the exposure triangle affects your image and how I, in a very simple way, set those numbers, settings, whatever you want to call them. The first thing I want to talk about is the shutter speed. Now, this is as straightforward as it sounds. It is the amount of time it takes for your shutter to open and close while taking a photo. This can range anywhere from something that we'd call a long exposure for like 30 seconds or longer, all the way to 1/4000th of a second, real fast. That's real quick. Now, obviously, the longer your shutter is open, the more light comes in. The less time your shutter is open, the less light comes in. Makes sense, right? The next part that's important to talk about is your aperture. Now, your aperture is that little F number you read, especially with getting a new lens, which, by the way, if you're struggling to buy a lens and you don't quite know how to do it, I made a video on it. I'd encourage you to check that out. Basically, the lower your f-stop is, or that f1.4 or whatever it is that you have on your lens and your camera, the lower that number is, the wider your aperture is open, allowing more light in, but the bigger that number, the narrower that aperture becomes, and consequently less light comes into the sensor. The last part of the exposure triangle is ISO. The easiest way to understand ISO is it's artificial light. And in layman's terms, you really want to avoid using ISO as much as you can, but don't be so afraid of it that you don't use it. You just don't want it to be the first thing you use to set your exposure in your image or video. Now let me talk to you about why shutter speed can affect your image and kind of how it does, not just with the light, but in general. Keep in mind, not only does it control how much light you're letting into your sensor, but it also controls how much information it's capturing. So for instance, if I'm taking live action sport photos, I don't want to be shooting at 1 second. That's way too long. Everything's going to be way too blurred. You're not going to quite get what you're looking for unless maybe that's your style. But on the other side of that, if you wanted to take a long exposure at like nighttime to get those nice brake trails that we see on highway photos and those kinds of things, you might want to shoot for 30 seconds. Literally, your shutter is open, and then it closes after 30 seconds. We aren't going to actually sit here for 30 seconds. You thought. The last part we want to talk about as far as the exposure triangle is how aperture affects your image. The lower your f-stop, the more depth of field you get, that nice blurred background. For instance, right now in this video, I'm shooting at f1.4, which is part of having a prime lens, is getting that low of a number. And it gives you this really nice bokeh effect, especially with the lights back there. It looks amazing. It's something that almost every photographer and videographer just wants to kill for. It's the reality of the craft, guys. But you don't always want to have the lowest number. For instance, if I was gonna take everything in here and wanted it in perfect focus, I would want to have my f-stop higher, maybe probably around f5, f6 if I had to guess, at the highest. But that also makes that narrower, so where everything's in focus, but there's less light coming into the sensor, which means I may have to figure out another way to get more light to the sensor so the image still looks good. You stick with me. I know this sounds complicated, but we're gonna get to a simple version here in a second. The simple way that I have managed to master exposure, and I say master, and I'm gonna use that term loosely because I'm still learning too, is to start with your aperture. Lower that number as low as you can go while keeping everything you want in your shot in focus. Take that as low as you can possibly get it and start there. After you've set your aperture, you're gonna wanna move to your shutter speed. Now, a couple of things that are important to note with this. If you are shooting handheld, please make sure that you do not get your shutter speed slower than 1/125th of a second. Trust me, your hands are way more shaky than you give them credit for. You don't want to go any slower than that because that will show in your images. The other thing you want to keep in mind is specifically if you are shooting video. If you are shooting video at, let's say, 60 frames a second, you want to make sure that your shutter speed is no slower than 1/120th of a second. And of course, it kind of goes on, it's that same rule. Basically, double whatever your frame rate is in your shutter speed is the easiest way to phrase that and kind of understand that. But on the flip side, if you are shooting with a tripod at this point, you can go way slower because your tripod's holding everything still. But still, if you're taking a photo, let's say, we'll go back to the portrait concept. If you're taking a photo of a person, you want to make sure that they are able to stay still. So I still don't recommend you go any slower than 1/60th of a second unless that person can stand perfectly still. And if you are that person, please teach me your ways. Maybe it's too much caffeine. That's probably, never mind. You don't need to teach me. I know. I'm just not going to fix it. And finally, as the third section of the exposure triangle goes, take your ISO and crank it until your photo or video is in perfect exposure. Keep in mind, you can do quite a bit of degraining, denoising, however you want to phrase that, in post-production, which is where editing becomes your biggest friend, especially if you have a lower end camera that puts a lot of grain in at a lower ISO. But I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful in some way. If you did, please bless that like button. And if you thought it was the stupidest video you've ever seen on the internet, man, condemn it to the dislike button. I promise you, I will still love you regardless. And until next video, this is Bearden for Hope, signing off. Hey, you thought it was over, didn't you? Go buy some merch. Okay, I'm broke. Trying to get out of debt. Don't you see? You see it right here.